History Lecture Series. Most importantly, I first want to give an update on the mascot. For those of you who've been with us this whole time, Chloe turned 7 on Thursday. And unfortunately, very exciting to me, it's the biggest news lately. Chloe, unfortunately, still has dancing on Mondays, and so it's just tough to compete with dancing. But we're going to keep trying, especially this season sometime. Another couple of announcements is towards the end of our season. Next season, our 10th, is going to be a big one, of course. We will start getting your help with the next email out and the next 2 lectures. Start getting out information so you can tell us what lectures you'd like for next year. Since it is going to be our 10th and kind of a retrospective, we've been thinking about maybe bringing back some of the most favored lectures over the 10 years, over the 9 years previous. So we're going to get your advice on that. Also, we do have 29 of the lectures that we've taped over the years on the internet. What I'm going to do is, with the email coming up, it'll come up in a week or 2, I'll email out the list of all those lectures with the link, so you can just click on it and go to the lecture. And I also put the sheet of paper in the regular mail out, so of course you have to type in the link and everything. So I want to make sure that if you're not on our mailing list, to pick a card up as you leave the lobby. All right. And now I'm very, very excited about our speaker tonight. There are just a few of them each season that really embodies all that the newest History Lecture Series was created for. In this case, it's one of the top local history topics, maybe in my opinion next to the Battle of New Orleans, and one we've really tried to have a lecture on for quite some time, and that's near and dear, I think, to probably the relatives of many of you here, and that's the Trappers' War. Mr. Bryan Gowland is going to be our speaker tonight. He's a historian and educator, done a wide range of other things, including, I just found out, being mayor of Abita Springs for 12 years. He has a 40-page scholarly article, historical article that he wrote on the Trappers' War. And he's not going to read the whole thing tonight, but he's going to tell you the good stories from it. And so I'd like to, if you would, give a warm welcome to Mr. Bryan Gowland.
I'm going to do my absolute dead level best to tell you everything I know or I can tell you about the Trappers' War, and I'm certainly not going to read it, because there's one thing that used to aggravate me when I go to a history lecture and some guy sit up there and read the paper that I could have read too, you know. So, Trappers' War was and still remains to a certain extent a controversial subject in St. Bernard Parish. And I know that because they have a lot of family members of principal people from the Trappers' War here tonight. Miss Dorothy Binge, who just spoke to you about the Islanio Festival, is a granddaughter of Mr. Manuel Malero, whose name will be mentioned quite a bit in this article. And I have my cousin Sam here, whose grandfather, Sam Gowland, was the only casualty in the Trappers' War in the shootout that ensued. And I have Mr. Philip Liverday, who introduced himself to us, whose great uncle was the chief lawyer in the lawsuit that involved the Trappers' War. So, and I'm sure that there are other people here who had relatives on one side of the other in the Trappers' War. Now, I had the good fortune to have relatives on both sides of the Trappers' War. I'm very familiar with muskrat trapping. I'm very familiar with Lower St. Bernard Parish. My mother was raised in Delacroix Island, and my grandfather lived there. He was a fur buyer. He was in the fur business, and spent a large part of my childhood crawling around on the floor counting muskrat skins, and spent a lot of time in the homes of many of the people at Delacroix Island. On the other side of it, the Gowland family, of course, my great uncle Sam Gowland was the person who happened to get killed in the final shootout that culminated the Trappers' Walk. But before I get started, first of all, I would like to offer my thanks to Nunez Community College for inviting me to come here. I'm very excited about being here tonight. I'm very excited to be in St. Bernard Parish, where I grew up, and being able to talk to people who are very interested in this subject. And I would like to thank the people who helped me, with it. The Islamic Cultural and Heritage Society, Mr. William Highland was very helpful. Ms. Dorothy Binge, I spent a lot of time at the Delacroix Corporation up in the area where they used to keep all the muskrat skins, looking through title deeds of property in the area that is shaded right there on that map. And also some people I spoke to. Some of the people older people from down in the island, Miss Edna Gonzalez at White Klosky, Miss Emily Vega, and Mr. Irvin Perez, who is not with us anymore, and family members on both sides. So the question would arise from that is, how did I become interested in the Trappers' Walk? Well, an incident occurred when I was a teenager, young man. My Aunt May, who is Sam's grandmother, and my mother were very close. My mother would go pick her up every Saturday. She lived in a little mother-in-law apartment down on Pakenham Street and Jackson, I forgot which one, but my mother would go pick her up, and they'd go to the store and make their little groceries. And they would come to the house and sit down and spend the whole afternoon. We had a big old lounge chair, and Aunt May would sit in that chair, and she and my mother would talk, and Aunt May would always have a ubiquitous cloud of Pall Mall smoke around her. And one afternoon, everything was nice and peaceful and copacetic as it usually was. And Aunt May said, just blurted out, I'll never forget this, she said, "Those people did not have to shoot Sam." And she said that to my mother. Problem was, my mother was one of those people. She was raised at Delacroix Island. So my mother got real defensive, and they started going back and forth with the stories that they both heard from both sides of the issue. And it didn't harm their relationship. They continued until my mother passed away. But, because they loved each other dearly. But when I was doing some graduate work, I said, I got to find out more about this. I have to research this. I have to know what happened, because I heard about it all while I was growing up. I'd go down to Delacroix, my grandpa would talk about it. I'd hear Manuel Malero's name a lot, because he was a competitor in the fur business with the company that my grandfather represented. At any rate, that's how I got started on it. Now, a lot of issues are coming into play. First of all, what type of place was St. Bernard Parish in the 1920s? Well, they had about maybe 3,500 people living in the whole parish. And they had one way in and one way out. You went from Jackson Barracks all the way to the end of the world. And the only way you could break off of that was to go to White Klosky and Shell Beach. Well, all the way to Shell Beach back then was before they had the ship channel. And, but that was when, I was a child, but that was the way to get down there. But Delacroix was extremely isolated. It was extremely isolated all the way up until the 1920s. Now, the political structure that took place at that time is there were a new wave of politicians coming into play in St. Bernard Parish. A group of people pretty much commandeered control of Louisiana up until the 1920s, when the reform movement occurred. They were called the Bourbon Democrats. And a part of that group of people in New Orleans was called the New Orleans Ring. And down here they were called the Old Regulars, because they had dominated the political structure for so long. But in the 1920s, a new group of politicians came in, and that included people like Huey Long, and also figures locally like Leander Perez and the sheriff, Dr. L.A. Merrow. There was an aura of lawlessness in St. Bernard because this was the era of Prohibition. And people in South Louisiana didn't take too kindly to Prohibition. And running contraband whiskey up to the gambling houses, from down the road up to the gambling houses in Araby was a big business. As a matter of fact, if you were a whiskey runner, a bootlegger, it was an honored profession because the illegal gambling and the illegal whiskey was supplying entertainment and booze for the people from New Orleans, where all of that was illegal. So they had to have somewhere to practice, the Crescent Club, the Riverview, the Highlight Club. A lot of old people remember those places on the riverfront in Araby. Well, that's where all of that took place. So another thing that came into importance in the 1920s were muskrats. Now, muskrats became very important because in the 1920s, with the economy booming in post-World War II United States, fur coats became very fashionable. As a result, the animals that wore those coats were full of people dead. In this case, muskrats also became very valuable. So trappers come in. So that's the stage that was set. It was, politicians were not really fighting hard to enforce laws against prohibition and illegal gambling. So they were going along with that, and they ushered in a new group. Now, the people who got involved in this as a group were the Islanio people of Lower St. Bernard Parish. Now, who are the Islanio people? Well, a brief history is they are descendants of the Canary Islanders who were brought to Louisiana in 1777 by Governor Bernardo de Galvez, who St. Bernard is named after, by the way. Governor Galvez, this was right prior to the American Revolution, he was made governor of Louisiana because he was a soldier, and the Spanish crown figured that within time Spain would jump into the fight in the American Revolution, and they wanted to be prepared by having enough people in Louisiana to supply soldiers for the regiments that were needed. And large numbers of people came to Louisiana. That's when the Cajuns, many large numbers of Cajuns came to Louisiana, settled in the southwest part of the state and down by Lafourche. And then a lot of Spanish people were brought in from Malaga, Spain, and they settled down around New Iberia. And the Islanio people. Now, the Islanios were from the Canary Islands. Some of them, they had 3 settlements of Islanios. There was Cherbourg, which was in Lower St. Bernard Parish, Valenzuela, which was on Bayou Lafourche, in Galveston, which was on Bayou Manchac. The other 2 settlements kind of drifted out, and the people were more or less assimilated into the French overculture. But the Islanios in St. Bernard maintained their cultural identity, they maintained their language, and lived pretty much a peaceful life. They lived in a plantation economy until after the Civil War. And when the plantation system started to falter, many of them drifted down to the lower parts of the parish, to Delacroix Island. Now at Delacroix, they could make a living hunting and fishing in the marshes. And the way that they did their business is they didn't really have a road. They had a train that went to Benchek, what we call Reggio now, And from that point on, you had to take a boat or perhaps an ox cart when it wasn't too wet to get to the train station from Delacroix. So the people at Delacroix would capture what Alcide Fortier referred to as copious amounts of duck and fish, bring them up to the train station, transport them up to the French market for sale. There were also trappers. They trapped muskrat, otter, nutria. They didn't have nutria, they had muskrat, otter, and other fur-bearing minks and other fur-bearing animals. But muskrats were relatively worthless. If a trapper caught a muskrat, he just cast it aside. Well, all of a sudden, that changed. In the 1920s, trappers were getting $1.50 a muskrat hide, and the marsh was full of muskrats. And they could make somewhere $5,000–6,000 in a year. In the 1920s, that was big bucks. So the trappers became engaged in the muskrat business. So did other people. But because the marshes developed value, the land developed value. Up until that time, nobody paid attention to the Islamios. They were so isolated. They spoke Spanish. They established their own social structure. They established their own set of rules. And nobody bothered. And they stayed down there and lived their lives pretty much apart from anyone else. Somebody referred to them, one of the old timers referred to it as a nation within a nation. It had its own identity. Pretty much free to live how they wanted to do, but they maintained a close-knit society. And very close-knit. Matter of fact, as I went around talking to people from the island and doing some stuff, I didn't find anybody with whom I was either related or had a common relative. And anybody from the island knows that's the way it is. And they were very close. My mother said, well, when you lived at the island, if you went to the bathroom on one end, somebody at the other end knew that you were there by the time you got off. And anyway, but all of a sudden, somebody owned the land. And somebody on the land said, these guys are making money off of the rats on my property, then there's got to be some kind of way I can make money from them. So all of a sudden they started saying, well, we're going to charge leases for the right that they had to trap muskrats on my property. And that's where things started getting dicey. Before the 1920s, people owned the land. The federal government gave the land to the state, and then the state turned around and either sold it or leased it to individuals, pennies on the acre. And all they had to do was pay the taxes on it. Well, some people didn't pay the taxes. The Islamios were down there just trapping muskrats, didn't pay attention to anybody owning the land. And so when the land became valuable, matter of fact, some of the land in the marsh became more valuable than dry land. So people said, we need to make money, just like I said before. So there became a very, very active land rush for land in the marshes. If the taxes weren't paid on it, all somebody had to do was pay the taxes on it to grab it, or all the land companies could reclaim it for the back taxes, and people were going to the clerk's court's office in Plaquemine and St. Bernard and looking for whatever they can get their hands on and hustling it up. Now, one of the people who happened to hustle up about 100,000 acres of land was a guy by the name of John Perez. He is first cousin of Leander Perez. Now, at the time, Leander Perez was rising to power. He got elected in 1920 as a district judge from St. Bernard and Plaquemines Parish, and in 1924 was elected district attorney in St. Bernard and Plaquemines Parish. And Perez did not hesitate to use his position to his advantage. He aligned himself with the sheriff of St. Bernard Parish. Now, and that was Dr. L.A. Merrow. Merrill was an interesting guy. He was 6'4", weighed 300 pounds. He was a country doctor. He traveled around, and people liked him. He was could be a very nice guy. He'd always have candy in his pocket for the kids, and he'd go talk to people up and down the road, taking care of them when doctors made house calls. And but he was well respected and well thought of in St. Bernard Parish. He had a distinguished education. He studied at Tulane, London, and Paris, and was a researcher at Johns Hopkins. Now, how he wound up being a doctor in St. Bernard Parish, I don't know, but he also became sheriff. And the way it looks to me is that, like Merrill said, well, look, him and Judge Perez got together. Perez needed Merrill. And the reason Perez needed Merrill was because of the numerical superiority of the voters in St. Bernard Parish. Merrill could hustle the votes in the parish, and Perez could get the votes in Clackamas, but in order to be a judge or a district attorney, the judicial district encompassed both parishes, so Perez needed Merrill's help. So they aligned themselves. They aligned themselves politically and formed a very, very formidable force, because in those days, the sheriff, and even as young as I can remember, the sheriff was the boss in his parish. The sheriff was the political boss. And they had what they called courthouse gangs of people who say, well, you know, they aligned themselves with the sheriff, they would get all the good jobs, policemen and other things, and that's how it went. So Perez hooked up with Merrill, and together they formed a political alliance. And a lot of people who want to be involved in politics in St. Bernard or Clackamas Parish knew that they had to get on the good side of one of those two guys. And a lot of people did. And that's how they, you know, got into minor political offices and got elected. It was always a ticket, you know, and Merrill's ticket always won. And he maintained a very powerful control over St. Bernard Parish until his death in 1938. Now, when John Perez got the property, he started posting no trespassing signs. And he started demanding leases for his property. And the St. Bernard trappers couldn't figure out what was going on. This was an alien concept to them. Nobody bothered them for generations, and all of a sudden, they got to pay money to trap on land that they thought was, you know, just theirs for the use. Didn't care whether they owned it or not. All they wanted was muskrats. And so they hired Leander Perez to protect their interests. And that's where things went south. Perez had a position with the Islanos that, in his book, L'Injonson, describes as a witch doctor in a primitive society. He was dealing with a bunch of guys who were, for the most part, illiterate. Many of them didn't even speak English, they still spoke Spanish. And all he wanted to do was to trap. And he trusted Perez. He's powerful enough, you know, he's a big-time politician, and if he represents us legally, he can help us, you know, wiggle our way out of this. All we want to do is go out there, build our cabins, and trap muskrats. That's what they used to do. They would build a cabin out in the marsh, they drag a family out there, everybody getting involved, they go out and trap them, bring them back in. Everybody would get involved in skinning them and stretching them and wait for the fur buyers to show up. Perez so completely dominated what became known as the St. Bernard Trappers Association that the secretary of the association, Benny Harris, just took some loose leaf paper, took the minutes at the meeting. He then turned them over to Perez, who took them to his office, edited the minutes, and typed them up and kept the file there. The treasurer of the association was Leon Merrill, who happened to be the first cousin of the sheriff. And he kept an account mostly, but he turned everything over to Perez, and Perez kept all the money in his private bank account. As a matter of fact, Perez and Mello got together on a land deal and needed $3,800, so they borrowed it from the Trappers Association. And in the ensuing court trial, Leon Mello said, hey, the minutes told me I could do whatever I wanted with the money. Well, Perez kept the minutes in his office, Perez kept the books, kept the money in his private bank account, and the whole board of directors simply deferred to Perez. He had a free hand. Well, anyway, in 1924, 2 years before the shootout, they came to a deal. John Perez said, okay, and he worked it out with Leander, who was representing the trappers. Here's the deal, $50 for a lease to trap a certain area of land, pretty sizable area of land, and $50 dues to the St. Bernard Trappers Association. And so the trapper said, well, that's not a bad deal, it costs $100. I can make a few $1,000s, so, everything's cool. I will go ahead and, we'll buy into the deal. And thanks, Leah, you did a good job for us. Well, that didn't last long. Leanne and his cousin John got together and said, $50, we can do better than that. So Perez engineered an interesting scheme. He decided to get the board of directors to appoint a trustee who would then take ownership or control of the land from John Perez. Now, the trustee that they named was a guy by the name of J. Walter Michel. Now, Michel was best man at Leander Perez's wedding. All right, and so, it was up to the association to appoint the board of directors. Well, at the association meeting that the board of directors was going to be appointed, the only announcement were placed on little flyers inside bread wrappers from the Merrill and Leon Bakery and distributed in the parish. Well, once again, most of the Slanos were illiterate. They trusted Perez. They said, well, and so it wound up, Perez pretty much named the board of directors. And there were a lot of irregularities involved in the appointment of the board of directors and the board of directors meeting at which Perez got the deal cut. When the board of directors said, okay, we're going to give trusteeship to J. Walter Michel. Well, that got the trappers' attention. Why? Because Mr. Michel now demanded $150 a year lease. So it tripled, went from $50 to $150. And the trappers said, wait a minute, this isn't working. So they called the meeting at the courthouse. The president of the Trappers Association was Brooks Calero. They met at the courthouse. It's a school down at Lower St. Bernard was. And had a big crowd there. And Mr. Brooks Malero appointed his nephew, Manuel Malero, to be the chairman of the meeting. And Malero, in turn, brought in an attorney, Oliver Liverday, whose great nephew is here today, Philip Liverday. Philip Liverday is the guy that Perez beat to become DA in St. Bernard Parish. Anyway, but Perez objected. And he really objected strong. So wait a minute, you can't do this. And the guy said, well, hey, wait, this is our association. Brooks Malero said, we can appoint who we want to be the chairman of the meeting. This is the guy that's going to run the meeting. So all of a sudden, Perez was not in complete control. And that's, things started getting ugly. So Oliver Liverday got up and explained the deal, explained how it all went down, and how he felt like the appointment of J. Walter Michel to the trusteeship was irregular, it was illegal. Well, Perez and Malero almost got into a fight. Perez, accused Malero and Liverday of manipulating the deal so they could get all the land for themselves. And Malero called Perez a liar, and they went after each other, and the other guys there had to break them up. And so after the meeting was over, well, the board of directors and the Trappers Association voted to declare the lease deal to Michelle, the trusteeship, irregular, and wanted it nullified. They also wanted Perez fired. Perez refused, and he took the rest of the board of directors into a meeting group he controlled and said he had those resolutions passed that those guys were lying and things weren't true. So now the factions are split. Some of the trappers stayed loyal to Perez. Most of them decided to go along with Malero. Now why? Manuel Malero is an interesting story in and of himself. He was a success story among the Islamios. He had a grocery store in Delacroix, and he also had a fleet of trucks. Now the trucks were used to run contraband whiskey up the road. His business was bootlegging, one of them. He also was in the muskrat business, and probably the wealthiest Isleño in the state of Louisiana at the time. But he was one of them, and they now were putting their trust in him. And so they decided, after the meeting at the courthouse, to sue Perez and Michelle. And the suit was Sabinard Trappers versus J. Walter Michelle. And the crux of the case was that Michelle's trusteeship was illegal based on the shenanigans that took place in getting him appointed. And Malero said, I'll pay it out of my own pocket. And Oliver Liverday was appointed to be the attorney who would bring the case before a court. Now, the court was held in New Orleans. There was no way they were going to get a fair trial, say, but on Plaquemines Parish. It was held in the courtroom of Judge Boulter. And it was a three-ring circus. They had all the trappers were there, the courthouse hallways were packed, fistfights broke out. Malero and Perez went after each other in front of the judge. They got both fined for contempt. The president of the secretary for the association, Benny Harris, was fined $250 for sarcastically answering Liverday when he said, "Do you keep the minutes?" He said, "Yes." "Do you keep them on paper? What do you do?" And he said, "Well, sure, I keep the minutes on paper." "What do you do? Think I write them on toilet paper?" Judge hit him for $250, and then Liverday told the judge, "Wait, Judge, I don't have a problem with this guy. It's that guy that I got a problem with." That was Perez. And then Perez shot back at him, and then they both got fired. Well, and also in the middle of the trial, Perez and Merrill got together, and Merrill swore out warrants for Liverday and Manuel Malero. Let me get the name straight. Sheriff Merrill issued warrants for Liverday and Manuel Malero for criminal libel. And they were going up and down the road, rounding up people and throwing them in jail. Liverday ducked out of it by getting a Supreme Court judge to issue a writ, preventing the arrest from taking place. So the trial went back and forth, and finally on July 26, Judge Bolton ruled in favor of the trappers. He said, yes, the meeting was irregular, Michelle was not appointed legally, and so we're back to square one with John Perez, with the trappers paying $50 a year. Well, it still wasn't over. They appealed the case to the Louisiana Supreme Court. And so now there was uncertainty. The the St. Bernard trappers figured, well, you know, we won this case. It's going to be held up in the Supreme Court, so let's start staking out our locations in the marsh. Trapping season was right around the corner. Let's stake out our property in the marsh, and let's start building our cabins. Well, John Perez started hiring guys from outside, guys from Bayou Lafourche, all the way over to Orange, Texas. I mean, from all over South Louisiana, because the crop of muskrats in St. Bernard Parish was going to be a bumper crop. They had a hurricane in August, brought a lot of fresh water into the marsh. It fed the grass. The grass was green, the muskrats were thick as flies. So it promised to be a really big season. The Islanos were excited about it, and the other guys that came in were also excited about it. But now what were they doing? They were bringing outsiders in. They were bringing outsiders into that marsh. And they were staking out and claiming the same territory that they were used to trapping. So it got pretty nasty out there. And then law enforcement got involved. Sheriff's deputies were seen helping to hack down camps. The John Perez hired law enforcement officers to come in and do something about it, and some of the law enforcement officers were former Texas Rangers. Now, you know, it's bad enough to the Islamios that you're going to bring in outsiders from outside the island, but to bring in guys from Texas, you know what I mean? It was just like unthinkable. Matter of fact, the decima that Mr. Urban Perez, rest his soul, sang about it was, y'all know what the decimas are, right? They're songs about events that take place in the Islamio community. And to pass the stories on from generation to generation, they would sing the songs in Spanish. One of the songs that was sung was named La Guerra con Tejanos, the war against the Texans. And I heard him sing it. I sat in his living room and heard him sing it. I was privileged to hear that. Well, cabins were being burnt. Areas were being staked off by two different people. And to make matters even worse, in October, the Louisiana State Supreme Court overturned Judge Bodner's decision and given John Michel the trusteeship and honoring the lease that was worked up by Perez and his board of directors. And also, the court also upheld an injunction by Michel to keep any trapper he didn't want off his property. Well, conditions began to escalate, and the trappers began to arm themselves. There was a lot of lawlessness going on at that time. There were arrests being made, threats against people's lives were being made, fights were taking place, people were in the marsh struggling over who was going to have the territory to trap those rats. The Islamists, this was their livelihood. This marsh represented everything they had. It represented how they made a living. Muskrat hides, fish, ducks, shrimping, whatever. But they needed that, but they weren't going to make it through the winter. They were dependent on that muskrat season. They invested money. They had to buy traps, and they had to get the other equipment, you know, from the racks that you stretch the muskrat skins on to the little hand crank thing that you run the skin through and take all the juice out of it before you stretch it on the rack. I'll discuss that some other time. But, so the trappers armed themselves. And that brings up November the 16th, 1926. On the evening of November the 15th, they had a guy at Carnarvon, Camp Carnarvon. His name was Rudolph, nicknamed Cutoff Sherry from Homer. he had a lugger named Dolores. And the lugger was moored at the camp, and he was approached by a bunch of guys in a motorboat. And they were going to commandeer the Dolores to go to Delaware Island to, and a quote that I got, and then this is once again word of mouth quote from the newspaper, is they were going to go to Delaware Island to make some Spanish soup. I guess that would be what they call caldo now. You can get something to go to the Slano Festival next weekend. At any rate, and one of the members on the boat was a young marrying justice, was his title, former marrying justice from Araby, named Sam Gowland, whose grandson happens to be here today. And it's said that in his pocket he had a note that said, Albert Miguel Gonzalez, 11/15/26, where he has it that he had some kind of blood feud with Gonzalez. And so he was heading down there to help all these deputized people. These are all deputized guys. Some former Texas Rangers, some commissioned St. Bernard Parish deputies. But these were all guys that were connected and political players in the Merrill political power structure. Well, at 8 o'clock a.m., the Dolores came chugging up Bayou Gentilly and turned into Bayou Terrebuff, right at Delaware Island. The observation was that there were about 200 armed men lining the shore, waiting for the boat. Now, how did they find out about it? Well, it's the Islandio grapevine I told you about earlier. Somebody let somebody know, and those guys knew, and they were waiting. Well, that's where the story gets cloudy. Of course, the guys on the boat say the Islandio shot first, and the guys on the shore say the guys on the boat fired first. And that was a big argument that my mom and I made out of who shot first. Well, nobody knows. It's just like, the shot that started the American Revolution. Nobody knows who fired it. Nobody knows who fired this one. But once it started, the shooting got intense. But the shooting from the shore was much more intense because they had people on both sides the bayou, and the boat was in a crossfire. Sam Gowland, unfortunately, was struck immediately. He got hit with buckshot, and the bullet that killed him penetrated his brain. He fell dead to the deck of the Dolores, and the other guys ducked. I mean, one deputy burned his leg on a manifold. He tried to get so deep down in the boat. Charlie Kerr, the Texas Ranger, had two guns strapped on, like the guys in the Old West movies. He ducked for cover too. The boat was riddled with buckshot. The fuel line was ruptured. The boat stopped running, was drifting around the bayou. And eventually, one guy raised his hand to surrender. He got shot through the hand. And somebody on the shoreline had a crutch shot out from under him. But when things died down, the guys either swam to shore. One guy swam to a trapper's cabin that he knew. He said, "Man, get me up the road." And he was brought up the road. Other guys were brought to shore. They were beaten. One guy suffered a fractured skull, and the others were beat up pretty bad. And they were forced to sign a piece of paper saying that they were hired by Leander Perez to come to the island and that they fired first. But they said they didn't have much of a choice, so they were going to get killed. Now, that's when the trappers, they were going to go after Perez. Now, Perez was over in Plaquemines Parish, and they went after him. He was able to escape because they were going to kill him. He was able to escape because he put his family in a rowboat and rowed him across the river to the other side. And a group of trappers under Mr. Ansardi, the Plaquemines Parish Trappers Protective Association, invaded the marsh from the other direction. And the trappers that came in, the outside trappers, got out of there. They left their traps, their cabins, their guns, everything. They got out of there just as fast as they could because they knew that things were looking grim. As a matter of fact, Mr. James Wilkinson, who was an attorney, rode a bus from Point LaHash up the road, and he said the bus was loading up with guys who were getting out of the marsh because they were afraid for their lives. And Wilkinson comes into play later on, but he was an associate of our Liver days. Well, Sheriff Merrow didn't know what to do. The trappers sent their children up the road. They blockaded the road, ready to defend themselves if anybody came down there to try to do something different. Later in the afternoon, the coroner, Mr. Gonzalez, and Gowland's brother-in-law, George St. Germain, came down to reclaim his body and brought his body up the road. And they were allowed to do that. Well, Merrill wouldn't have any of it. He wasn't going to the island. And he knew better to go down there. So he tried to get some help. He enlisted the help of the federal marshal, Victor Loisel. And federal marshal said, it's not my job to chase down every muskrat catcher in Louisiana. You do your job. Then Merrill, in desperation, talked to the New Orleans chief of police and said, man, help me out with this. And the chief of police said, no, I don't have any authority down here, you take care of business. So finally, in total desperation, Merrill appealed to the governor of Louisiana, who at that time was Ormel H. Simpson. He wanted the governor to declare martial law. So this was an interesting twist of the story. The governor said, well, I'm going to go down there and check it out. So the governor went down to the island. And once again, they had to know he was coming. He didn't announce that he was coming. But when he got down there, he went into what he called the principal establishment and found a bunch of guys hanging around having a drink. Well, I said, hey, I'm the governor of Louisiana. And I said, hey, how you doing, governor? He said, you mind if I look around? Yeah, go ahead, do whatever you want. Man, you're the governor of Louisiana. He looked around, he didn't see any guns, and he left. He said, you know, what's the matter with the sheriff? I said, say, Sheriff, I'm not going to do this till you enforce the law. That's your job. Well, Merrill responded by stretching a rope across the road all the way up to Jackson Barracks. And he was going to stop people and arrest them, I guess, who were trying to escape. And that resulted in 4 arrests. And so John Perez's trapping empire was in total collapse. It was in revolt. And that's basically what happened. So, on November the 23rd, he sold 100,000 acres of trapping land to Manuel Malero for $800,000. That's $8 an acre. Malero hocked everything he owned in order to buy the land. He went deeply into debt. And he said at the time, and then also all legal action was dropped. So basically, Perez lost it. He lost that battle. And he faded over into Plaquemines Parish. He tried to make inroads in St. Bernard again after that, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Malero bought the land with the intention of selling it to the trappers. His stated intention is, I really want to make a profit off of this property. I'm going to sell it to the trappers. Now, the proof of that was at the Delacroix Corporation on Decatur Street. I always wondered why all the fur guys were on Decatur Street. They have Steinberg, Maradona Brothers, and Delacroix Corporation were all on Decatur Street. But I remember going there very well. But anyway, I went up there, and Miss Binge was so gracious to take me up there, and we looked through the records. And there's box after box after box of real estate deals. And the real estate deals was that the trappers were going to pay off the buying price. They could buy the land and pay off in, I think it was 6 installments. And at so much per year. And all they had to do is when it was like sharecropping, I guess. You know, when it first came in, they would then sell first to Malero, and he would deduct what they owed him, and they would get the rest of the money. So it was a favorable deal to both of them. Now, not all of the land was sold to trappers. Many of them did buy the land. The map of ownership at the Delco Corporation represents that area. It's got like checkerboard on it, where certain people were able to actually buy the land. One title deed in particular that I looked at was Mr. Raphael Robin. And he bought a piece of land, signed a deal, but a couple of years later, he wouldn't catch enough rats on that property, so he asked if he could transfer the title and, you know, pick it up from where it was left off on another piece of property. And he was able to do that. I don't know how many of them actually completed the deal. But things, you know, and Mr. Malero, who was in the fur business, also started to hire outside people to trap the property that the Isleños chose not to buy or not to lease. And so there was some resentment about that. So, and that part of it, you know, maintained some controversy about Malero on the part of some of the Isleño people, because they felt like, well, he's another rich guy trying to take advantage of us. To his defense, he obviously, you know, there was proof that he tried to sell the property to the trappers. And in 1927, things changed. Because in 1927, a bunch of rich uptown guys used whatever power and influence they could through the mayor of New Orleans to get the Corps of Engineers to blow up the levee at Carnarvon and let, you know, because the river was so high, it was threatening to break. The levees were threatening to break. So they dynamited the levee at Carnarvon and let all that water run down by Terre-Bœuf all the way down. And Malero was prevailed upon to be the person to act as an intermediary between the powers that be in New Orleans and the Isleño people, who were convinced to evacuate, to put them up in hotel rooms until, you know, the flood went down, and they went back down there. Well, since Malero's land was flooded, and it was going to cost him a bunch of money, he got Mr. James Wilkinson, his attorney, one of his attorneys, to prevail upon those guys to settle with him, and he got a nice settlement, $1.5 million. And and eventually his company that he formed, the Acme Land Company, became known as the Delco Corporation. And Delco Corporation still today owns a lot of that land down in Lower St. Plaquemines Parish and Little St. Bernard Parish. And Malero wound up pretty good out of the deal. I remember when I was a kid, and my grandpa would be down there buying muskrat skins, and I'd always hear them talking about Manuel Malero, because he was a competitor. My grandfather represented another company. Now, Sheriff Mero remained powerful, and him and Perez remained aligned together until his death in 1938. And he obtained large tracts of land in St. Bernard Parish, familiar with the name Mero Foundation. Leander Perez became an absolute and total dictator in Plaquemines Parish. Now, he tried to become a power in St. Bernard again. He was okay as long as Mero was alive, but after Mero passed away, Sheriff Rowley became sheriff, and in 1940, just to illustrate that politics made strange bedfellows, Perez tried to get Manuel Valero to run for sheriff against Dutch Rowley, so Perez and Valero could hook up and develop the same type of power structure that Perez had with Sheriff Merrill. It didn't work out. And again in 1956, Perez backed up a fellow by the name of Tony Nunez for sheriff against Dr. Nicholas P. Trist. I remember that election very well. A lot of people declare Perez as political boss of two parishes. But I was a child at the time, a young teenager, and I remember distinctly that I went to every rally. My grandpa made me go. He was involved in politics. I went to every rally, and at every rally, the forces of Dr. Trist, because that's the side it was on, soundly castigated Perez. So they didn't have the fear of Leander Perez in St. Bernard Parish that they had in Plaquemines Parish. And I think the Trappist War had a lot to do with that. But in Plaquemines Parish, Perez reigned supreme. Now, the best source of information on that is a book by Mr. Glenn Johnson named Leander Perez, Boss of the Delta. Perez manipulated the legal structure to gain control of all of the mineral-rich land in Plaquemines Parish under the Delta Development Company. And the Delta Development Company, which was leasing the land from the police jury under Perez's direction, for pennies on the acre, was making megabucks off of the Delta Development Company leasing the land to the sulfur and oil companies that proliferated in Plaquemines Parish. He controlled literally every job in Plaquemines Parish. One person said, if you're going to go to Plaquemines Parish and do business with Leander Perez, dealing with him is like handling a demijohn of nitroglycerin. He actually declared war against the governor of Louisiana over the appointment of a sheriff in Plaquemines Parish. Barricaded the road, armed his deputies. It didn't get very far. And just to illustrate the kind of power Perez had, a good friend of mine who lives in Abita Springs worked in Plaquemines Parish. And Perez was such a powerful advocate against racial integration during the civil rights era that he was doing everything possible to keep that from happening in Plaquemines Parish. And they had a little Catholic school down there that decided to go ahead and allow itself to integrate. And my buddy, who was working in Plaquemines Parish at that time, had a good job, refused to take his children out of the Catholic school and put them in the segregated public school system that was developed. And he wanted his kids to get a Catholic education. And he got fired from his job because Perez directed whoever had him hired to get rid of him because he wouldn't fall in line with what Perez wanted. That's power. But it was to our benefit because Calvin moved to Abita Springs and became a leading citizen and served with me for distinction in 16 years in public office. After Perez died, his two sons got into a fierce battle over who was going to gain control of all of that money and all of that property. And it got to be a pretty nasty. This was Leander Perez Jr. and Shalom Perez. It became so nasty that the parish president, Luke Petrovich, decided to investigate, and investigate he did. And when it all came out in the wash, it came to fore that the people of Plaquemines Parish who had property and the way in which it was all managed had been terribly built. The Perez brothers were sued in court, and because the suit had merit, they bought out of it. And when they bought out of it, they settled for literally tens of millions of dollars, plus had to return all the property. And Perez, who was a hero in Plaquemines Parish, fell into infamy. He was no longer a hero, and they even had a main artery in St. Bernard Parish named Judge Leander Perez Drive. And after all the story came out about Perez and what actually happened, they changed it to Judge Melvin Perez Drive. As Judge Perez Drive. That way they were able to save a lot of money on street signs.